Good morning. Thank you for attending this first session of this conference. And we are here, this is part of the 5 Years Out series. And we are going to be discussing the book Culturing Interface. And the author is here. We're going to be talking about the particular research project. And we're going to begin with Shini Cheng, and she's currently at Santa Clara University, the author of the book, and she's going to be giving a little description of the origins of this particular panel as well as her research. And then we're going to have a discussion, a brief overview of impressions by the panelists, and then a discussion of our general impressions, and hopefully we can get some audience participation as well. So, Shini, would you like to start?
Sure. Thank you, and thank you all for coming. Good morning. I want to talk a little bit about how I started about with this research project. I had a relative who was working in the border of El Paso and Juarez, and he was originally from Taiwan, like I am. And he had mentioned to me about some of the challenges that he was facing at work, particularly with different group of managers. They are either Taiwanese by nationalities or Chinese, and some of them were Mexican, some of them were Mexican Americans. And so he had talked to me about the possibilities of perhaps trying to do some research and understanding how to facilitate their communication at work. That's how I started to know about, there is a population of Taiwanese and Chinese living on the border of Texas and Mexico. And so I designed a few workshops, and then I went down there. I was in Ohio at the time, getting my PhD degree from Bowling Green State University. And so I went down to the border area for one summer and then another winter break, and I did some workshops there, particularly dealing with intercultural communication and interpersonal relationship. And that's when I really realized about the daily activities and adjustments a lot of spouses or partners of these managers, particularly and their children, and how they're adjusting to the local environment. So I decided to set out a longer ethnographic research, particularly in El Paso. And it was interesting because originally I was thinking about, I wanted to understand the managers' perspectives in working and living in the very fluid and sometimes contradictory area with a lot of history. And then it ended up that I actually spent a lot more time with the family members of these employers in the multinational corporation. And again, that sort of taught me about being an ethnographer, is to be able to be flexible and sort of understand what was emerging from that setting. So I did a 6-month ethnographic research in El Paso, and where I learned about the histories that sort of contributed to the perceptions of these newcomers. So then they all had an interesting understanding of certain hierarchy in that local environment, and then they decided how they're going to cultivate their identities according to the current space that they were in, which was El Paso, and then right next to us. And also they were forming their view toward who they want to become and can become in relation to the larger global relationship, meaning the relationship of Taiwan and China, the relationship between China and the U.S., the relationship between U.S. and Mexico. So it was much larger than just the border of these two cities. And so that was sort of how I started the project, and then what I found interesting in terms of the spatial construction and how that construction affected daily communicative practices. And I think I'm going to stop here, and then maybe we can have more discussions later.
The next presenter is Amy Human from Texas Tech University.
Good morning. This is it. I think that there were multiple and significant insights that we, at least that I gained, from reading the text and the work that Shani has conducted through this ethnography in El Paso and Juarez. And I think that in terms of some of the questions that she had posed, that it provides meaningful insights to the directions that we might take in intercultural communication. First, it provides insights in ways that dismantles that idea of the pan-ethnic Asianness by looking at complex social relationships and complex identities. And so she works with this idea of space-making and cultural hybridity. She untangles that web of social interactions that have taken place within this community, and we see differentiations of experiences in more complex ways. And so as far as that relates to the directions that we might be headed, going 5 years out in intercultural, it takes us even back to a few years ago with Shooter's call for revisiting the centrality of culture and immersing ourselves within cultural communities and cultural spaces. And so that's one area that I think that we gain through this deep description, a complex understanding of not only how folks are negotiating their spaces and their identities, but also how we might engage in internalized forms of oppression. And Patricia Hill Collins writes about this idea of the ways in which superiority, inferiority may manifest themselves within our individual, symbolic, institutional forms. And also this idea of internalized oppression that is pointed to within this work. And so how members then of, if we think about transnational identities in these communities, how they might take on the dominant forms and the dominant ideologies, and as a means of crafting their identities and making their space in these borderlands. And so I really appreciated that. And then her focus on the Manchinian allegory, too, really brings light to the hierarchical categorizing systems or processes that we might engage in as we make sense of our social worlds. And so through deeply immersing herself within this community, paying attention to histories, political kinds of context, then I think that we come to a better understanding of that. So those are some areas that I think were particularly important in this work. Also, this idea of interface and being someone that might be, if we're thinking about interface in a way as existing in this, she talks about this fluid space, interacting with various systems, entities. And we take on that idea in a way that's kind of like the idea of being a cultural broker and how we might go about that. How is that limiting and problematic, and what possibilities might that hold? And so that is something that, as we have a discussion, I think that hopefully we'll touch upon each of these aspects further. But then also important to her work is taking on and continuing on with the call that Conquer Good suggested of being dialogic in the way, as a critical ethnographer, that we would go about doing research, how through ethnographic inquiry, that is a way, an epistemic stance, a way of knowing and better knowing ourselves and also our social world. So I appreciated within the text that she came to toward the end, but all throughout, but then toward the end had this some self-reflexive moments for us to revisit that went on throughout the course of her time there. And so it also revealed tensions between voicing or not voicing our own positionalities and our own perspectives, and how that can lend itself to, again, possibilities, but then also in what ways does that ever change and affect communities that we engage in. And so I really appreciated that self-reflexivity as well. So for me, there were maybe 3 or 4 areas where I think that this text then and this research takes us into, continuing further into intercultural inquiry, and provides several trajectories that we might follow for future research in this area. And importantly, it reveals complexities. That's, for me, reading the text, that was something that was so important, is to really get a sense of this complex negotiation of identities that were taking place with people in the community. And it brings it alive for us and meaningful in ways that, otherwise, and if students are reading it, and potential and future intercultural scholars are reading it in ways that make meaning for them, and that they might be able to link to their own processes. So those are a few points that I think that I would like to raise later as we go on. But
Okay, thanks, Amy. Next we'll hear from Nick Zoffel from San Jose State University.
And I'm actually now at Manhattanville College. So,
yeah, no problem. I was really excited to initially participate on the panel because when I started, and I had talked to you about your project before while we were both at Bowling Green together. And one of the things I was really excited about was how the text talks about diaspora politics, reflexivity as a response to cultural consumption, and even exploring kind of the communicative impacts of the blurring the lines between social space and geographic space. And for me, as a person who's very vested in critical communication pedagogy, or at least how to talk about issues of transnationalism in the classroom, what I appreciated about the work is that it really holds me accountable to the ways in which I move through and teach culture, communication, and really the communities that I tend to discuss in my courses. To talk about critical communication pedagogy paradigm directly as it relates to the text, I realized that there were a couple things that I needed to accept if I'm going to have conversations about transnationalism and about cultural consumption and about space in ways that I hadn't really considered before. And one of those was that the educational activities need to be designed for some kind of relevance. It's very easy, I think, for teachers who teach culture and communication, whether it's intercultural or whether it's a seminar of any kind. I think it's very easy for us to consider activities that play with the identities and snapshots that exist. It's a very different kind of activity in which we challenge the students and we challenge ourselves to consider something beyond the cultural snapshot. And so I think that's something that the text offers, is at least a starting point, and a very good starting point, might add, to have that particular conversation, because it for me at least, it becomes a continuous moment that I can show the students that I struggle with this stuff too. I don't have to look like, I can be the expert in the room per se, but I don't have to be like an expert who's got it. The second thing is it involves me being involved in a process where I have to negotiate meaning. It's very clear to me that students don't really understand what transnationalism is in relationship to post-colonialism, in relationship to globalism. More often than not, they get these really horrible snapshots from the media as to what those different things mean. And so it's that I have to understand that as a teacher, I got to negotiate meaning. It's part of it. The next thing is that and this is what's more exciting from a research perspective, is that it provides us a very real example to bring ethnomethodology to our particular discipline. I just happen to be fortunate enough to work with an advisor who encouraged me to really look at the communicative implications of identity. And I think that there are some advisors that take that task on, and you can do kind of not a surface level, but you can provide a very a snapshot. I keep towards that. You can provide a snapshot as to what an identity is, but I think it's very different when an advisor encourages an individual to really explore the linguistic and the space and the cultural nuances of a group. And to do that from within, and to use not just ethnography as an approach, but to consider things like indexicality and reflexivity and some of those aspects. And in relationship to pedagogy, reflexivity becomes that space where transnationalism can move beyond cultural snapshotting and consumption, and to really engage in conversations about what does it mean to consume an identity, to consume a culture, and to consume a culture. In general, when I'm considering the pedagogical implications, I tend to approach transnationalism by using conversations of cultural difference and really establishing, as the book discusses, culture as this thing that's produced and maintained act. Typically, when we talk about performativity in communication, we tend to go to Butler, and Butler discusses that there are like these two cognitive rules that people use to organize information to construct a social reality. It's rules of consistency and rules of economy. The former suggests that people have categorized events and persons, and when students tend to try to talk about culture, whether it's Chinese, whether it's larger Asian, or they're making the snapshot judgments about a particular culture, they tend to use a past information or past event as that sole marker, without really going beyond it. And pedagogically, it really wasn't until more recently that became a relatively scary act when you start thinking about how fluid culture actually is. The people who are involved in our classroom conversations, if they are transnational individuals, they themselves are representing a cultural snapshot of what they experienced, not what's continually being produced, which moves into that economy rule that Butler talks about, that it tends to recognize that situational cues test alternative applications to categories. And I think for when you present a student with like a rule of economy and say, oh, by the way in which you understand your culture, that might not be all there is, that's a relatively scary place to take a student in a classroom setting because of the classroom setting's finite nature, to say, oh, by the way, your identity is broader than you actually think it is. And I think that provides a very interesting conversation about diaspora politics, about cultural consumption, and about what does it mean to have a social and geographical space. And so I guess what I want us to ponder, or I want us to consider, is if I'm going to push an agenda of exploring transnationalism as culture, as intercultural communication, then I need to recognize that I've done little to really address the accomplished nature of ordinary activities, which I'm not very good at my job then. And I say that with being a little glib. I mean, I think I'm pretty good at my job. But I wonder in what ways have I really missed out on some very real conversations and very real ways to not just push my research agendas and my pedagogy forward, but to also encourage students themselves to become advocates for the very real possibilities of transnationalism. And so selfishly, I want to hear more about how we move from cultural snapshots to really an ongoing reflexive understanding of culture. And so thank you for letting me be part of this. And the pedagogical implications of this stuff is, I think, very exciting for communication programs that are really, I think, moving from, that are really who don't have traditional intercultural programming or teaching, and have more of a communication and culture and media focus, which is the institution that I'm at now. So thank you for letting me be part of this, and thank you for writing the book.
Okay, and thank you, Nick. And next we'll hear from Chin-Chung Chow from University of Nebraska at Omaha.
Thank you, Dr. G. Oh, thank you. I think for this issue, I really appreciate what Xinyi has done, because what she tried to do kind of provide me a lot of ideas, and I really want to determine what is my identity. I think in both, in Taiwan and in America. I think in Taiwan, kind of similar to Xinyi. My father was from China, and I'm a second generation of Chinese. So a lot of people just kind of define me as a Chinese rather than Taiwanese. But, for me, I really feel I'm not a Chinese and I'm not a Taiwanese in Taiwan. But when I come to America, I really feel I try to tell everybody I'm a Taiwanese rather than a Chinese. I define myself as a Taiwanese, as an international instructor here. And to be honest, I haven't taught any course about intercultural studies or communication yet. But recently I tried to read Xinyi's book, tried to read some people's articles about this. And I think one thing maybe try to reflect my identity construction here. It's proposed by King. I think what she said is about communication competence, especially for the host communication competence, including 3 perspectives: cognitive, affective, and the operational approach. So for the cognitive, you need to use the language very well. And you need to understand their cultural values, understand their jokes, which I always told my students, I cannot understand your jokes. And if you want me to tell a joke, you cannot understand. You won't laugh. You won't laugh at my, what I told you. Either. And the second one is about affective approach, which means you need to kind of have a motive and the willingness to learn about their culture, about who they are. And also you need to kind of appreciate everything they try to do. For example, they enjoy sports, which I don't, and they by the law very much. Here, I'm doing so, but when I go back to Taiwan, I become like a Taiwanese who always try to against the law, especially when I drive. And I think the third one will be operational. How will you try to express both the cognitive and the affective, communication behaviors? So I think, through this issue, through Xinyi's book, through these kind of articles, I was kind of doubt about myself. I didn't do well with this. I couldn't speak good English, and I cannot correct my accent, my pronunciation. And also, I don't appreciate kind of their values, like sports, like freedom, a lot of things. And so I really feel I don't kind of try to build the significant symbols with them. So right now, after this issue, after this panel, after this study, I think I need to rethink about my identity and how should I do to get involved in American culture. And later on, this is just what I thought, last night. And I prepared something, but I think later on we can address this issue, then I will have a more contribution. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now we'll hear from Rosalyn Cantu from South Texas College.
So I prepared something I thought I'd read. For me, Xinyi's book does a nice job of providing implications of envisioning future research and culture and communication in relation to borders and traveling. As you read the book, you get a sense of the goals of the Chinese-Taiwanese transnational community in El Paso, Texas. In essence, these goals are community goals for self, children, and education. I grew up in the lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas, attained my PhD in the Midwest, and currently am teaching at South Texas College, located about 15 miles from the U.S.-Mexican border. This area, while predominantly Latino, legal and non-legal status, is also comprised of people of Anglo, Chinese, Indian, Arabic, African, and Philippine heritage. 3 years ago, I returned home after having lived in the Midwest for about 9 years. In those 9 years, while I was away, I'd returned home for holidays, and I always noted change. While I was away, there was a boom in population and economy. So much so that the valley, as many of us call this area, seemed so different in my mind, my memories, my experiences, my home. It all seemed so cosmopolitan, and it seemed to me that Latinas and Latinos in this area had also changed. However, not long after arriving, I realized that as much as the valley has changed, the valley remains the same. And what do I mean by this? Although the valley may outwardly look different in terms of the landscape, the shopping centers, schools, highways, and now border wall, this space and place contains much similarity to the prevalent attitudes, values, and beliefs which I grew up with. The goal of continuing my education was to affect change within my community in regards to attitudes, values, and beliefs concerning the meanings attached to being from this space and place we call valley, the valley. In the past, I have regarded the valley as the stepchild of Texas because of the history of political abuse and neglect. I was reminded of this and my identity, called out on this, when I stopped in San Antonio on my way home from Ohio. The white bartender at the Hard Rock Cafe asked my traveling companion and I where we were from. I responded by explaining that I was moving back to the valley after having lived for years in Ohio. He responded by saying, you can get the girl out of the valley, but you can't get the valley out of the girl. While this comment was uttered jovially and seemed innocuous, it contained layers of meaning about family, education, relationships, opportunities, and status. But how do I explain all this in a quick and smart retort? I let it go. I am interested in how we talk about cultural identity and change in the valley, in terms of Mexicans, Mexican Americans, white, and all the growing numbers of people of various heritage in this valley. What are the similarities and differences as we each negotiate our roles as community members, citizens, and non-citizens in this place we call home? In her book, Shini talks about the comments made by the transnational community in El Paso, such as the Lao Mo coming over to enjoy American benefits, and other comments that they make, such as, there is no culture here. So do we. For example, let's see. Culture and identity is talked about by Mexican Americans on the U.S. side of the border through phrases such as son del rancho, they're from the ranch. And what they mean by that is that people are abrasive, unrefined in dress, and educated in social norms. One radio station disc jockey on a Tejano radio station has reappropriated the meaning attached to being from the valley and celebrate this identity by saying, eres clica, you're part of the clique. And by uttering la palabra del día, the word of the day, when a caller utilizes a unique Spanglish term, in essence celebrating this Spanglish. Shame of having ties to Mexico seemingly is no longer the case, as we have students who readily share about their ties to Mexico. And other students share that they are residents of Reynosa, Rio Bravo, and Camargo, Mexico. An overwhelming majority of these Mexican students speak to me about their accent and not being able to speak well. Beyond that, however, I've not been able to engage them in discussion about culture and identity. So Shini asks, what are the challenges and or promises in communication research about minority groups? For me, the challenges and promises lie in critiquing social practices for affecting change in attitudes, values, and beliefs, and through this, affecting change in poverty, education, and violence. Shini poses the question, what are some of the traditions in intercultural communication studies that might be revisited in the current environment? I think that gender studies in the border areas should be revisited. In addition, I think that a focus on gay studies is necessary. Members of my family and former partners have had to negotiate this identity with much resistance and difficulty. I am committed to sharing my insights and knowledge about communication based on my own lived experience. As a Latina brought up on the Texas-Mexican border, I continue to negotiate the values embedded in the American and Mexican cultures, the attitudes, values, and beliefs embedded within communication and identity. Through identifying how these come into play in our everyday utterances and practices, we may be able to critique these practices in order to affect social justice.
Okay, thank you, Linda. And at this point, I think we're going to sort of move into a general discussion about the book. But before we do, I just wanted to make a couple of comments. And one is, it is a wonderful book. It's a wonderful read. And we also should recognize Tom Nakayama for editing this series. And he takes a large credit for moving this into the general readership in communication studies, and it just reinforces how important it is to have allies to this kind of work in order for us to be able to utilize it not only in our own research but in the classroom and with the students that we advise. Shini's book reminds me of quite a lot about Ruth Behar, who had written a book, I think it was in the late 90s or earlier in this decade. It was called The Vulnerable Observer. And that was her follow-up book to her widely acclaimed ethnography called Translated Woman, The Story of Esperanza. And I was reminded of that because to a large well, the premise of that book, of The Vulnerable Observer, was that the ethnographer has to come in contact and confront their own passions and their own fears and their joys in order to be able to understand what the residents are going through in a particular locale. And I was reminded of that book because that's what Shini has done. In essence, what you did was you dropped yourself into this zone of intersections. And intersections of identity and economies and as well as hopes and fears, and I remember the phone calls that I would get sometimes from you, and I could just envision you sitting alone in your room trying to figure out what your next move was. And so I just want to congratulate you for your own personal courage, the personal exploration that we get in the descriptions and the journey that you took through the perceptions of the residents, and that's exactly the kind of description and reflexivity and interpretation that the best of intercultural communication studies has to offer, and this work certainly does that. Having said this, are there any reactions that you have to the particular comments of any of the presenters, and then maybe we can just maybe ask some other further comments in kind of a freestyle way. And the only thing I would ask is when you do make comments, just speak into the microphone so that it can be recorded.
Again, thank you for all these wonderful comments that you made, and I really appreciate how, I remember I was really scared, not only when I was there sort of trying to figure it out, I had all this plan, I wanted to go in there and then talk with, all these people I wanted to talk with, and it didn't turn out that way, and I didn't get to, live with the people I was supposed to be living in with. That was one of those, phone calls. I was thinking, Dr. G, I was supposed to live with this manager, and because the company lost a big client, and so there was a little bit concern in terms of having a researcher sort of being so close to, at least that was my interpretation. again, it wasn't like, I was learning about, being direct in communicating, trying to make things as transparent as possible. So I went in with like, I'm going to be an honest researcher, but at the same time, I realized that, I would hear stories that have many different versions. To one instance, I wasn't sure what was real or what wasn't. So it was really different from the kind of environment I was familiar with, which was in classroom setting, in the university. We talked about, trying to be really clear and communicate your emotions, which was all very helpful when I was building relationship with the local, with my friends, I call them, so I really appreciate how you, confirmed about that was a toil that was worthwhile going through, and I do wanted to also, for thinking about sort of the future trajectory. We mentioned about like how issues about spatial construction, geopolitical relationships, how those larger structures have that direct impact on our daily choices. And I so appreciate you all mentioned about the educational opportunities and choices parents are making as newcomers who there seems to be discussion about being an authentic whatever, and I think that would be something that we can kind of address, and how might that issue be discussed in the future research about culture and communication. So I think maybe we can talk about some questions or...
Right, and also, are there any questions that you would like to ask regarding the text or anything at this point?
Can I ask them?
Sure.
I came from Japan to attend this meeting, and anyway, I'm really interested in your project, but I just came here, and I'm not sure about what kind of book you are talking about. So could you introduce the book? I'm so sorry to ask the fundamental things.
Right, the question was regarding the book itself.
Culture and interface.
Yeah. Well, there's a copy, so if you want to take a look, anytime you can. It's called Cultural Interface, Identity, Communication, and Chinese Transnationalism. And it was basically a critical ethnography on a group of Taiwanese and Chinese newcomers who are currently living on the border of El Paso and Juarez. And the Chinese population, again, it's according to the census, so then it's people self-identify themselves as Chinese or people of Chinese descent. It's only 1% of the larger population in El Paso. So it is somewhat a small group of people who are living there, and they, most of them, they speak enough English to sort of go around, but then that's a very interesting space for them, because they feel that, we thought we're coming to America. People are not speaking English here. That's the comment that there's no culture here in El Paso. It is not America. Mm-hmm. So then, therefore, their daily communicative actions and choices are deeply affected by the way they view the meaning of El Paso, Texas. So in my book, I talked about sort of the historical context of that specific location, and how my friends and participants made sense of their surroundings in relation to the current space that they were in, which is El Paso, America, in this city that is next to Juarez, Chihuahua, Mexico, the place that they came from, which was Taiwan and then China. So it was just very complicated organizing of this different spaces. So then they actually put different spaces in the ranking. There's a certain ranking system there, and then therefore that structure in terms of their cognitive understanding of their various environments, as a way, to me, I think is the logic behind their choices. And so then they would choose certain neighborhood to live, and making sure that their children learn certain language, but then they would go to certain restaurants as opposed to the others. So then to me it was to me I'm really sort of saying like culture is more of an action, a verb that is not just something it's actually performed and embodied in daily choices. So it's not that naive or innocent anymore. It's actually always a choice, and then I'm trying to understand how that choice was made, and then to me it's the cultural process of this travelers, a group of travelers, because they travel a lot. And then again it comes to issues with immigration practices, and a lot of them cross-border on daily basis, and of course they talk about political events such as the 9/11 event, the impact of that on them. So it's just that it's much more sort of politically and economically and socially and culturally also interwoven, I guess sort of the locations, just such, it just has such a lot of different kind of tensions, and then see how people sort of maneuver and negotiate on a daily basis, intentionally and perhaps unintentionally, but choices are made.
I went to the Westminster in California. That was the Ritual Saigon. It's called Ritual Saigon. They have the Vietnamese immigrants live there, and in that Ritual Saigon is more vivid. That if you go there, you can see everything written in Vietnamese, and then you will see the Vietnam market and shop and so on. So just I wonder that you said in this parcel, you said you have different ranking, and then you said you have tension, or you said you have the choice to create your own identity living there. I just wonder that is there any power imbalance among those different groups, or ethnic group, or social society, economical groups? So is there any imbalance in terms of the power?
The comment or the question was relating to any power imbalances among the different populations that are present there along the border region.
Yeah, very much so. And then also I think that was something that I was fascinated about, because, this group of friends that I made during my research, we're talking about different kind of power in terms of capitals, right? So then it could be like economic power for my friends. They really view that. That's why the spatial relationship between sort of globally was so important, because for them, they understood somehow the Anglos to them in their mind hold the most power economically, culturally, and politically. So then they were very clear about that. At the same time, they also are very future oriented. And then again, this group of people, they're in IT business. So then that also is something that we talk about interface as, because that's one father used that term to describe that. He's actually seeing his children as interface between the West and the East. And when they say West and East, they really meant China and U.S. So then they really, I think that when they see that power, current power imbalance, they also are not separating the power in the current environment and then the power in the past. So then they felt that, we talked about sort of the Anglo had the most sort of control there, but then also they thought about in the past, because Mexico lost the war to the U.S. So then they are looking, so there's a different units when they were looking at that kind of power relationships between nationalities. So then they look at the past and they thought, well, but you want to look at China now. So then they were very conscious about possibilities for the future. So then that's why they invested so much in sort of a cultural capital in their next generation, because they understand the current power imbalance. At the same time, they kind of feel that they can see that power relationship is going to be shifted in the future, and then they wanted to make sure the children and future generation are positioned in a perhaps more advantageous space. So that's when I think that's when the communicative practice are so interesting to me, because it's about the kind of holidays to celebrate, the way to celebrate certain holidays, the certain kind of style that the children are going to have, and so in answering your question, yes, there are power difference and imbalance, right, very clearly there. It's just that that relationship is not stable, it's not fixed, it's actually really fluid. And then I feel the friends I made there see that they're not just subjugated to it, but then they're actually they're actively participating in sort of molding that relationship.
And I think that's one of the great things about that particular locale, because if you had ended up in a less diverse environment or in a more monocultural environment, those same kinds of aspirations and the goals might still have been there, but they clearly might have been more below the surface. They might have been more subtle. But here they have to be expressed in very clear ways, because these judgments are being made about different populations.
Yeah.
And people need to they continually remind themselves of who they want to be and who they want to model themselves after.
Yeah.
And it's because they're contrasting themselves with the other populations that are there.
Yeah, exactly.
Amy?
Yes, that's something that also struck me about the text. And so when I was referring to untangling this complex web of social interactions that were taking place, the community members were taking up the dominant form. So they were buying into the dominant ideologies through practices, through going to the CCF church. And so in a very vivid way, we see ideologies like whiteness, patriarchy that might be part of the dominant culture being enacted and taken up by this group as a means of becoming American, and then really for their children being successful at this idea of an interface or interfacing. And so we can see all of these ideologies there that are at work. It's illuminated within this text, and so now we're naming them, we're marking them, and bringing those to light. What might go unnoticed otherwise, or we can't quite point to, but you made it meaningful through your narratives, and then when you were complicit with their enactment of ideologies, or so what is your role there? And so I appreciated that, and that's earlier when I was linking that back to Patricia Hill Collins, and she talks about interlocking axes. We can see all of these axes at work with gender, with race, with class, ethnicity, kind of all coming together. And so, and I think that that's part of what focusing on from more of a transnational kind of perspective that we're able to see here in these spaces, what is forged. And
I was going to say, pedagogically, what's interesting is that quite often, like the text that I go to try to discuss that notion of consumption is I go to Trilling, I go to Adorno, and I go to Ellul. But what's particularly interesting about your text is that it provides like an actual, and the word actual is not what I mean, but it provides a textual example or of lived experiences around a notion of sincerity, and you mentioned the word authenticity earlier, and I would almost want to shift from the notion of authenticity to sincerity, because Trilling observes that there's this we try to avoid a false sense of being something other than true to one's own self. So then what happens when a student has to consider what is your own self, when you start stripping away the different elements of the consumption that maybe you were just talking about, when you start stripping away those elements, so what actually is left? And I think for students, it's interesting for them to start thinking about what are the ways in which their particular cultural mindsets have actually been affected by 400 years of Western culture. In particular, it becomes this place where, yes, it's simple enough for us to say culture is a very fluid thing and it happens, but within that simplicity, I think is a really intriguing complexity that allows us to really take a look at how we produce an individual who becomes synonymous with something other than a cultural dupe. I think it's easy for us to critique and say, well, here are these individuals who accept very lay messages of humor, of religion, of education, and to actually say, now I want you to hoist that against the social signifiers of what does it mean to be Chinese within a particular kind of cultural context. And I think the text in particular provides something that moves us from theory to practice. And I think that there aren't a lot of... in my humble opinion, there are a lot of grand narratives about practice of the theories in relationship to transnationalism. And I think here's something that actually provides something that people can identify with. I can put my own Jewish cultural experiences and hoist those against those of the individuals in Texas here. And I think that provides something that theory and the practices that we usually talk about, it hasn't done. So, yeah. It pushes us forward, and that's what it should be doing. That's what our work should be doing.
We're kind of entering into the last few minutes of this allotment. Are there any other things that you'd like to add, or?
I have one question I want to ask Xingyi, but before I ask her, I want to kind of respond. I said I need to respond. No, her third question, because but I am going to use another perspective about method used. I think, as we know, normally we will have three perspective approaches to conduct research. Scientific, science, social science, and interpretive and critical perspective. And for each traditional approach has its inherited limitations. And there have been outstanding changes in the studies in the field. First, and foremost, Martin and Nakayama proposed the dialectical approach, which integrates the above three approaches in understanding culture and the communication by recognizing the interconnectivity among these three approaches and emphasizing the processual nature of intercultural communication. They work out 6 sets of dialects, for example, the cultural versus individual. And also, a Chinese scholar named Gu Jiazhu. Have you ever heard about him? Yeah, from Nanjing Normal University, suggested using semiotic and mimetics to study and understand dynamic nature of intercultural phenomena. To him, dynamic semiotics advocate that everything changes. And in the cultural communication can be understood as a sidal transmission movement. According to mimetic theory, imitation or copying of human-specific and humans do it naturally. So we try to copy other people's behavior or something. And the laws, both semiotics and mimetics, can be applied in every aspect of human culture. And they are particularly applicable to intercultural communication. Finally, Pinto emphasized that the analysis of culture and the cultural differences in the context of intercultural communication should not lead to stereotypes and generalization. The differences between people who inhabit the world are too complex to be categorized to the basic of a given number of dimensions, such as done by holistics, to name a few. By emphasizing a double perspective, which requires the matters should be seen from the perspective of person's own norms and values, as well as from perspective of other people's norms and values. Pinto proposed his three-step method for dealing with differences in intercultural communication context. Step one, just try to get to know one's own norms and values and the behavior codes. Step two, try to know the norms and values and the behavior codes of the other party. And step three, determine how to deal with differences in the given situation. So, what is common? What I mentioned. They are all depend. They are kind of interpret interpersonal, intercultural communication phenomena as a dynamic process and call for flexible and integrated approaches according to the nature and complexity of intercultural communication context. So my question would be, do you think ethnography is a good way to know about cultural behaviors or things? And also, I want to ask, because I feel you are kind of very close to the participants, and you also mentioned about they are your friends, and so I want to ask another question: how about if this study is conducted by a male who is more rational? Well, they have a.
I just got a kid. I'm not rational in my life. I'm just saying,
I say who?
I try to fake it. I was like,
Do you think that will be different? Do you think that will be different? Another question, I'm so sorry. Another question I want to ask is, how about if you could redo this study? What will you change?
And I think you've just proposed a new theme for research, and that would be male rationalist ethnography.
I would not like to be a participant in that study.
I do, but I do think that it is. I mean, I think to me that's a really it's a given. Like, I think researchers are instruments in the research process, and I think it doesn't matter what method one uses, your identities are there. It doesn't matter. I mean, but just by choosing that particular method, there's rationale behind it. Just like when my friends and participants, I'll answer that question next. But just like my participants chose to live in certain areas, opposed to the others, the west side versus the east side of El Paso, I think that choice is not innocent. different. And I think that choice was driven by many identities within self, and then the relationship one has to that environment, in the immediate environment, and even to the larger environment. So I think that the identity of each of us as an individual are just not involved in all choices we're making. So I think that, yes, if somebody who chose to do this same research inquiry from a different perspective, the outcomes are going to be different. I don't think that is, I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but it's just that I felt for my particular question that I'm interested in understanding the processes, like you said, the procedural of the cultural journey, then to me, critical ethnography is very exciting and very natural, if you will. I kind of critique the idea of natural innateness as well. But to me, I think that's to me the way to answer the questions that I had, because I wanted to understand the power relationships. I wanted to understand how that relationship came about and being maintained, and perhaps can be interrupted, or actually are interrupted in dating choices and lack of choices, perhaps, or avoid of certain choices opposed to the others. And so the third question was about my participants. I call them as my friends, and I think that was I think several ethnographers and researchers made already saying that it is a friendship where we start our relationship with participants, and so I feel that is something I'd rather be upfront and honest about, that they were my friends there. They helped me when I was there alone. Like one of the participants, Mama Ga, I kept calling her, she was the owner of a local shop, and I call her Mama Ga because she called me, she always call me Mei Mei. In Chinese, that could be understood as like a daughter, my daughter kind of term. And then she called me like that, so I think that's my friend. And every time I went to her shop to help out and do my research, she makes sure she said, Mei Mei, you're too skinny, let Mama order you a lunchbox. And then she always ordered me this wonderful Korean barbecue lunchbox. I just loved it and still miss it very much. And I think by calling them only participants instead of my friends who helped me, and then who actually, without them, there was no way for me to do research and then have this. So I feel like, to me, it is only honoring the trust they had in me and the friendship they gave me. To me, that was something that I rather being direct and then honest about. So I call them as my friends, and they are still.
Well, I think if we're thinking of future directions, too, that we see more and more in intercultural, when we're doing ethnographic research, that we might take on that type of approach to acknowledge and to embrace the types of relationships that we might have with communities and being maybe even a part of a community. So I think that kind of moving us in a direction, there are a number of scholars, I think, Lisa Tillman-Healy talks about friendship as method, and in my own work, I acknowledge that as well with an epistemic stance of engagement and try to work toward that rather than move away from that.
Yeah, and that whole ethic of speaking with.
Ethic of speaking with, right?
I think that it's, and what's interesting is because I know both of you are really best in ethnography, and I know like when I started out, I was really best in ethnography as well, and it's really been more lately, I'd say in the last 2 years, that I don't know why I stopped getting interested in the questions of why and more of how. Yeah. So I would even expand it to say consider ethnomethods in general, because there's the ethno in general. Yeah, right. I mean the ethnos in general will really allow you, I think, as opposed to some of the other research methodologies, really do allow you to take a look at the language dynamics, the power dynamics, the order dynamics that I think other methodologies can do, but I think are done in a particularly kind of unique way. Or they're done in a very particular and unique way to recognize the researcher's voice, but the most important part is to recognize at what point does your voice stop and at what point are you interpreting your participants or your friends or the people that you're working with. And I think that ethnography makes ethnography and the ethnomethods in making that distinction allow for a particular kind of reflexivity that allows you to recognize at what point is this your opinion, and at what point is this the voice of the people that you're working with. And I think even for students to get that, it just makes everything that we do so much richer in communication studies. We couldn't do it without your book.
We just have a couple more minutes. Linda, did you want to say anything? Any comment?
Well, I really enjoyed the book, and it reminds me so much. Of course, it's different, but it reminds me so much of the Valley. And so, as I had mentioned in what I shared with y'all, a lot of the things that she talks about, we confront. And so there were similarities and there's differences. And I guess, in talking about, you talk about epistemology, and we're not supposed to talk about ontology, but I'm reminded of John Warren's article last week, last year, in the Intercultural International Journal, and I really like that because it really gets at, to me, kind of what you're doing, and really what I had difficulty with being back home, and how do I grapple with this, because there is difference, and people acknowledge difference, and what is that based on, right? But a being. And so that is the norm, and so you've got to acknowledge that, and to critique it, you've got to acknowledge that. And so for me, it's just really exciting. It provides me with direction, and it provides me with ideas of how then, to your book and your ideas and John Warren's ideas, of how to then grapple with the Valley and with the hierarchies that are upheld in the Valley in terms of status. Oh.
Okay, I think with that, we're done. And I know there's another session right after that. Thank you all for participating, and have a good convention.
Thank you.